welcome back to another episode of the CyberPod with Kash and
Tarek.
In this episode, we're going to dive into the UK Data Protection Act, the DPA, which is the UK's version of GDPR, and what your responsibilities are as a business owner within the DPA. We're going to try something a little bit different today. So instead of just diving into DPA and covering everything step by step, because that'd be too dull even for us.
It's a whole dissertation worth of content, yeah.
Yeah. So what we will do is follow up this episode with a blog post, because we don't want to sit here like Joe Rogan and talk for 4 hours.
He has more interesting stuff to talk about. I think I give people about 2 minutes and 30 seconds before they're probably gone.
Yeah. To be honest, I don't mind Joe Rogan, but I prefer his podcast in little snippets.
Yeah, when they post the snippets from it, they're like 7-8 minutes. Awesome.
Yep.
A 3-hour episode. I've never been able to commit myself to that.
No, I don't think I've seen one either. So yeah. So that's not the route we're going to go.
Yeah.
We'll let T talk about DPA in detail to you this episode.
Yeah. So I mean, as we said last episode, in our opinion, regulation is probably the thing that gets small businesses to actually drive investment in the cyberspace. Up until that point, it's very much it's on the back burner. We'll put it in the backlog. We'll think about it in the future. All of a sudden, the regulation door comes in, and it's okay. There's a consequence if we don't do this. And like we said, the main regulation that is going to apply to all businesses in the UK is the DPA. So it's a good thing for us to cover today.
Before we jump into that, going back to our early days when DPA, GDPR was first enforced. DPA wasn't even heard of back then. Wasn't a thing. But yeah, there was the GDPR song. I don't know if you remember that, T.
It's taken me a good few years to get it out of my brain. So, thank you for digging this out.
It was torture in the beginning, and then it became a joke. And then it was a funny thing to do just for the reaction, I think. And then
I used to wind our old boss up, and I think that was the enjoyment from it.
GDPR. Yeah, never.
I can't listen to that again. Painful.
It's fun to comply with.
Yeah. Side note, I was chatting to my dad about when he first moved to the country, and he said that he was obviously looking for cheap accommodation to stay in, and as a foreign man to the country, recognised a YMCA sign and stayed at a YMCA hostel.
Nice.
Picturing my very reserved and quiet dad going to a YMCA hostel and listening to that song was quite entertaining.
Cool. So back to DPAT. The boring stuff. What is DPA? Tell us in a bit more detail.
Cool. So it's the Data Protection Act of 2018 that came into place to complement the EU's GDPR, right? So as the UK decided to leave and go through Brexit, we needed our own data processing regulation. And so there's stuff like key definitions of what personal data actually is, because there's so much data that's being processed and transmitted around. We need to know what's actually sensitive, what's actually personal, then we can better regulate that, right? Then it's the scope of applicability, right? So how does this range throughout your business? Where does this apply to in terms of your systems, your services, your different functions? You might be an organization that has some services in the UK, you might have some services abroad, so it might just be your UK services that come into question for this, provided that your other services don't come into contact with UK PII data. And it's the core principles that we're going to touch on in this session. So all about those principles in there, things that we need to cover.
Just to add in there, PII is personally identifiable information.
We're going to need like a bingo button for like buzzword bingo. Like if one of us forgets, just throws an acronym in there. Next, it's all about the rights of people, right? So at the end of the day, it's your personal data, so you should have a right over it. Now, you may have provided it to a company, or you may have provided it to a service, but you've provided it under certain conditions. It's not just, I've signed up to your website, put my personal details in there, and now you're free to do with them what you please. There has to be some sort of agreement about how that relationship works. And so that places obligations onto data controllers and data processors. We'll talk more about what those things are. But loosely, the controller is the controlling entity, someone that has that data, that stores it, that holds it. The processor might just be involved in the chain. And often people understand the controller side of things. They don't understand the processor side of things. Because in that journey, they'll say, okay, so, you want to sign up to like a car insurance provider. You're going to go on like moneysupermarket.com, put in all your details. They're going to provide that to the car insurance provider that you ultimately go for. So they're the data controller in that aspect. But you've still got a processor in there who did have access to your personal information for a period of time. Now, they might say, okay, we don't store it, blah, 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 but for that period of time, they've got your personal data. So if they don't take adequate protection over it, they still come under the bounds of DPA, right? So that's where the enforcement and the penalties come into place. So you have to have consequences. I mean, that's just basic conditioning, right? If you don't have a consequence, people don't take it seriously. And then finally, it's all about international data transfer. And this is the big one that I have to deal with quite often because, in the cloud security space, the joy and the wonder of cloud is that data can be anywhere, right? And we can share data in seconds, and it can be backed up, and it can be multi-site and available and amazing, and all these fantastic abilities. What's really difficult to pin down is where is that data? Because actually, you might have uploaded it to a website whilst you were in the UK, but that cloud provider then backs it up and it moves around in that journey, and it's everywhere that data resides. So it's a really important distinction, and it's something that affects a lot of organizations without them necessarily realizing, because they assume that, well, I signed up for an AWS account whilst I was in the UK, so clearly I'm storing data in the UK. Not always the case. So we're going to talk a little bit more about all of these elements in detail, and then hopefully you'll understand why we're talking about these details, why we believe regulation is such an important thing, and why leadership actually do take it quite seriously.
The fines.
Not just the fines, but the fines are a big part, right? I think if you brought the regulation in and didn't include the fines, there would be a lot less people taking it. So you'd still have some people, but yeah, the fine is usually what makes people stand up and pay attention. I think there was a period before GDPR came in where it was in force, but they weren't fining you.
Yeah.
And people were like starting to do like bits of stuff for it, but they weren't necessarily doing. Once the fines came in and people started to get fined, then people started taking it a lot more seriously. And that's always the way. But yeah, so that leads us into sort of these 8 key principles of the DPA. So do you want to start us off with number 1?
So it all starts with the ICO. That's the Information Commissioner's Office, and it's their job to provide the guidance to the organisations and to individuals about what their rights are and what their obligations are under the DPA. It's their job then to enforce all of this. They're basically the headmaster.
Yeah.
His job is to make sure everything goes well and it works how it's supposed to.
Yeah, and really important to actually have that presence in there. And then the next step, so step number 2, all about the audit side of things. And this could take different forms. So you will have companies that do like an internal audit themselves. So they'll look into themselves. They'll do a little review of how things are. These have historically not been the most accurate way to look at a company, because let's just say we both work for the same company. I'm doing an internal audit.
People may lie.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is a real scenario because we did work for the same company and I was doing the internal audit, and you come across things that you shouldn't be seeing, and you're told, don't worry, it's on the backlog, or don't worry, we're taking care of that. So you don't need to include that in the report. You don't need to highlight that because in 6 months we'll have done that. So it's all good. That's the need for an external entity to come in and actually say, these are the requirements. How are you meeting them? So, they need access to your premises, your equipment, documentation. They need to see evidence of these things. And one of my favorite words that I was taught when it comes to doing an audit is show me. Those two words are enough to scare the living daylights out of someone, because when you ask someone a question and it's a leading question and you say you have a you have an information security policy, don't you? You know that where I'm leading with this. You know where I'm going with this question. You're going to say, yeah, of course we do. In the back of your mind, you're thinking, right, make a note. We need to make one of these the next time he comes and looks at it. As soon as I say those words, show me. Now we got a situation. Now your laptop suddenly needs to do a 2-hour update. It's like, right, well,
oh no, Windows.
oh no, what can we do? So yeah, it's that classic case of you're getting a report back with a bunch of failures, and you're going, oh, didn't realise that was the case.
Yeah, but it's not just audits initiated by yourselves or bringing in a third party. It's enforced, or the ICO saying we're going to do an audit.
At that period of time, we need to see this. Yeah, and I think having those as like a regular thing is so key to keeping people on the ball, because say you did it every 3 years, a month before, people are going to take it seriously. Then for the next 2 years and 11 months, it's on the
if it's random, then you got to be ready all the time.
Mm-hmm. It's the same thing as like a hygiene check for a restaurant, right? If it was the first day of December every year they're going to come in, the final week of November, that place is going to be spotless.
Yep.
It has to be random. It has to be, okay, they might come in at some point and validate this. Yeah.
Cool. And then enforcement. So what happens if you're not applying? Anything within DPA in your organisation, if you don't have the policies or if you're not following the correct processes, it's the ICO's job to enforce that and force you to comply. Usually that comes with an audit, and then there's an audit report giving you a set amount of time to fix those issues, and potentially give you a written notice saying there'll be another audit within this amount of time, and then make sure you've got your stuff in order. Mm-hmm. If that doesn't happen, then, or if you have a major breach, then there's also the fines. Yeah.
And this kind of goes back to that discussion we were having earlier about, that maturity side of things, right? And it's demonstrating that you're actually taking some steps to secure your environment. And the majority of the time, the ICO aren't there to, they're not there to trip you up. They're not there to punish you, recklessly. They're there to look at cases of negligence. And ultimately, if they come in, like we said, cybersecurity doesn't completely eradicate the risk of an attack happening. It could still happen. But if an attack happens, or a big breach happens, and someone comes in, they look at it and they go, oh, so no one's updated the password for 12 months, or there's no logging enabled. And okay, that's now a problem, because that's not how did this happen. This is how it happened.
Yeah, you ignored best practice.
And in the case of fines, that's where you're going to see the ICO go, right, you didn't take adequate measures to protecting your environment. So you've got those two scenarios, right? It's 17.5 million or 4% of your annual revenue, whichever is greater, which, if you're one of the big, huge fintechs or insurance company, financial services, might be okay for you to stomach, but as an SME, that's crippling. You're probably not going to come from that.
17.5 million sitting around here.
You know what? If I did, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We'd be on the beach right now. Let's put it that way. But obviously, for less severe breaches, the ICO can use their discretion and maybe put it
Yeah, some
differently.
big examples, I think. There was a telecoms provider who were initially hit with £120 million fine But then when the audits were done and they checked to make sure the correct processes were followed and the defense strategies were in place, the fine was reduced to a couple of million. Still a lot for obviously a small business, but for a telecoms giant, pocket change.
Yeah, and it's that thing again, right? It's, can you demonstrate that you've tried to do something about this, and that you do have a program that is in place? Yeah, and that's when people start paying attention. You mention money, and they go, right, that's a big deal.
Especially when you mention big figures such as 17.5 million, or was it 4%? You said of your annual revenue, not profit. So,
I mean, I don't know about you. When I park somewhere and it's £2.50 for parking, I think, oh, I could get away with this. And I see a fine that says, £120 for the fine. I go, yeah, okay, I'll pay the £2.50. So yeah, £120 enough to get me focused on it. So yeah, seeing a couple million, yeah, that's going to get my attention.
And one of the things businesses have to do, so this is the next thing, is if you've had an incident, you have, where PII was accessed or breached, then you have to disclose that within 72 hours to the ICO. So in our blog post, what we will do is list a bunch of questions you should have ready. So if you have an incident, you say, okay, what do we need to report to the ICO? So we will share those questions with you.
Yeah, I think it's such a common one, because it's that thing of, okay, we've been caught here. Damage limitation. Damage limitation is the scenario, and that's when you talk about incident managers. That's what's on their mind. How do we reduce the blast radius of this? But ultimately, you have to notify. You have to let people know.
It's
that
not
data
just the ICO you have to notify. You have to notify the individuals that have been affected by the breach. So now, once in a while, you may get an email from a service where you didn't know you had an account saying, hey, your account was part of a breach, you need to reset your password. So that could be you to all of your clients if you suffered a breach where PII data was affected.
Yeah. That leads nicely into number 6, all about the data subjects, right? So when we talk about affected individuals, it's all about data subjects. It's those people's data, right? What GDPR and DPA tries to do is bring power back to the individual. So you've provided your data to a service, you provided your data to a company, but you've done it for a very specific reason. They're offering a service and that data is needed for that. Fine. You haven't given them permission to do anything with that data, sell it off to, marketing agencies and publish it on dark web forums and that kind of thing. You did not sign a term and condition to say, yeah, I'm fine with all of that, right? So what this step does is it allows data subjects to actually say, okay, what's happened to my data? Like, can I feel that my data's been violated, my rights have been violated, I want to see what's happened to this. You can potentially seek compensation for those damages, We talk about, I've had nothing too bad in my time. I think the ones I've seen have been maybe a Steam account, like gaming, that sort of thing. Probably my parents' credit card was on there, so I'm not too worried about that one. But you could get a notification that, like I said, your bank's been breached, or your medical practice has been breached. These sort of outfits have so much information on you that that might cause you significant damage, that information being in the public domain. So that's where you have the right to say, okay, I think my data rights have been violated here. I want to seek compensation for this. And yeah, I think it's...
Yeah, and it goes back to what you said earlier, those key terms that have been defined within the DPA, the right to be forgotten as a subject. So you can email a company and ask them to delete your data.
Mm-hmm. An interesting story, if anyone's watched, I can't remember the names of it, but I know there's shows on Netflix about like Facebook and data analytics scandals.
The Cambridge Analytica stuff.
Exactly. And in that scenario, people submitted, multiple requests to find out what had happened to their information, and Facebook and other social media companies chose to pay the fine and not reveal that information. And that's a difficult scenario to have, right? Where you don't necessarily know what's happened to your data. So
Yeah. From a company point of view, if you're processing large amounts of personal data or engaging in high risk processing, then you need to have a DPO, and a DPO is a data protection officer. Almost forgot what that was for a second. I had to glance back at my notes. I've been using the term DPO for so long. But their job is to be the point of contact for the ICO, but also for the data subject. So if somebody sends in a request to say, what data do you hold of me, it's their job to process that. It's also their job, if in the event of an incident, to say, do we need to inform the ICO, make that decision, but then collect the information that needs to be reported to the ICO. And if the ICO want to do an audit or anything along those lines, they will be the point of contact for the ICO to start all of that engagement. So they're almost like the middleman for everything between your business and data-related requests.
Nice. And then finally, number 8 is all about international cooperation. Touched on the cloud-based element of data these days, right? Often it doesn't just become one nation's issue. It's not necessarily something that's just impacted you in one space. If a cloud provider or a provider that's using cloud-based software is breached, it might be that data has spanned into multiple geographic zones, and so this is where the ICO then has to engage with different international data protection authorities, right? And I think it's important to be aware of the fact that different nations look at data in different ways. So there are some nations that have similar data protection regulations to GDPR and DPA. So, for example, if you're a UK-based company, you can process UK-based data in a EU server because GDPR and DPA match up quite nicely. Coincidence, right?
Oh, wow.
But there are other nations in there. So you think things like Australia, Japan are in there because their data protection is very similar to that. Whereas when you start looking into, say, the South American countries, they do have data protection regulations, but they're not as stringent as the DPA. So you can't say, okay, well, we're going to share our data, or we're going to have our data being hosted out of a Argentinian data center because it's nice and cheap and easy to use. It has to actually match up to GDPR or the DPA in this case. So that leads us. That finishes off our 8 key steps of defining DPA in a bite-sized version.
a very bite-sized version, but it's worth mentioning. We'll run through a detailed blog post ready for this. So we mentioned something like the right to be forgotten, and we'll make sure as a data subject you understand your rights, but also from a business point of view, and there's especially the small business owners, the chances are you'll be CEO, CTO, COO, CFO, and DPO. And probably many others that I've missed out of that C list. But yeah, small business owner means being jack of all trade, or jack of all trades.
Yeah, it takes us back to a funny scenario where you raise a complaint with a director, and it's like, okay, I need to speak to HR. Shock, that's them as well.
Oh yes, yeah. I'm HR. You can complain to me about it.
Who do you want to complain about?
Good luck. Working in small organisations, it's
exactly.
fun. The joy is never ending.
Yeah, but yeah, once again, thank you for being here with us on this session. To learn more about this topic, like Kash said, look out for the upcoming blog posts. And yeah, it's been Kash and Tarek on another episode of the CyberPod. Take care, and we'll see you on the next one.